Good afternoon. Perfect. Thank you, Esmeralda. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Courtney Thomas Tobin from the CHS, or Community Health Sciences Department, and I am delighted to welcome a friend and a colleague, Dr. Christy Erving. Dr. Christy Erving is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology and a College of Arts and Sciences Dean's Faculty Fellow at Vanderbilt University. Her research employs quantitative methods to explore how race, ethnicity, immigrant status, and gender interact to produce differentials in a variety of health outcomes. Using theories, concepts, and perspectives from several research areas, she's currently developing 3 related streams of research. First is psychosocial factors that influence Black women's physical and psychological health. Second is status distinctions in the relationship between physical and mental health. And third is exploring what psychosocial factors explain Black-white differences in mental health. In her research and teaching, Dr. Erving utilizes a health equity lens with the broader goal of reducing social disparities in health. Her research has received funding from the American Sociological Association, the Ford Foundation, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and the Woodrow Wilson Foundation. This year, she was awarded a Nordhaus Undergraduate Teaching Award from Vanderbilt University's College of Arts and Sciences. And so, again, we are delighted to have her and to hear about her really exciting work. Thank you, Dr. Erving. You may take it away.
Thank you so much, Dr. Thomas Tobin, for that very generous introduction. I'm really excited to be here. Well, virtually speaking, to be here, and hopefully someday in person in real life. So I'm going to get started. I just want to make sure that you can see the appropriate screen. Can you see the first slide of my presentation?
Yes, we can.
Okay, fantastic.
So, Dr. Erving, before we get started, just a quick housekeeping thing. We will have a Q&A session at the end of Dr. Erving's presentation. So we'll wait then to have more of an in-depth discussion. But if there are clarifying questions that come up, please feel free to drop those in the chat and we will raise those as we go along. So thank you again, everyone, and take it away.
Thanks so much again, Dr. Thomas Tobin. So despite being in the midst of a global pandemic and my not being able to be there in person, I am really excited to share some of the research that I've been thinking about. And I'm really excited to get your feedback because some of this is a work in progress. So I'll start today by just giving you a brief outline of today's presentation. So first, I kind of just want to give you a sense for where I've been and where I feel I'm going in terms of my program of research. Then I'll talk about the theoretical frameworks that I'm engaging, specifically surrounding Black women's health, which will be the focus of today's presentation. Then I'll introduce this kind of phrase or concept that I've been toying with the last few years of intersectional stress exposure, what it means and what might be some potential measures or indicators of intersectional stress exposure among Black women. And then I'll share with you the results from 2 studies focused on the Superwoman Schema scale in particular and how that has implications for psychological as well as subjective ratings of health. And then I'll round out the discussion today by talking about some of my future research directions. So first, I began my career intellectually intrigued by heterogeneity within racial groups and the health implications of such heterogeneity. While racial health disparities research tends to focus on comparing health across racial groups, my research and others suggest that examining distinctions in health within broad racial groups provides a more nuanced depiction of racial groups that have historically been studied sort of monolithically, as if they were all the same. So focusing specifically on Black Americans, in several papers I explore how nativity and ethnicity differentiates the health profiles of African Americans and Black identified individuals of Caribbean descent. Moreover, my work explored how social determinants of health, such as social support and social stress exposure, operate to affect these distinct groups in nuanced ways. And I expanded this research to other racial groups as well, revealing ethnic heterogeneity, not just among Black Americans, but also, as you may not be surprised, in the health profiles of Latinx and Asian American populations as well. Another stream of research with my amazing colleague, Dr. Courtney Thomas Tobin at UCLA, it clarifies and attempts to explain epidemiological patterns which indicate that Black Americans, despite historic and contemporary discrimination, as well as disproportionate exposure to stress and economic disadvantage, actually tend to experience similar and sometimes lower rates of mental disorders vis-a-vis white Americans. Often referred to as the Black-white mental health paradox, I contribute 2 interventions in this research area. So first, we've assessed in some of our past research whether these patterns are consistent across psychiatric diagnoses, as well as across social statuses like gender and age. And second, a search for explanatory factors underlying the paradox really transitions our intrigue of this paradox from the epidemiological to the sociological. And so in this vein of research, we've been examining a variety of psychosocial factors like emotional reliance, sense of divine control, and self-esteem as potential factors that underlie why we observe this mental health advantage of Black Americans. So moving to my next research area, despite the known relationship between mental and physical health, medical sociologists typically study either physical health or mental health. Yet research continues to show that about 1 out of 5 US adults struggle with both physical and psychiatric health issues. So in research born out of my dissertation, I introduced physical psychiatric comorbidity as a crucial health outcome to study because it's a more comprehensive or holistic way to think about measuring health. And I'm building on this work by examining sort of causal relationships between physical and mental health using data from the Health and Retirement Study and a forthcoming paper on the right that's forthcoming at JHSB. And in this study, my co-author, Cleothea Frazier, and I, we reveal these unique race, nativity, and gender vulnerabilities in the association between depression and chronic physical conditions like stroke, diabetes, and heart disease. And last, and this will be the focus of today's talk, I have this emerging research area focused on the psychosocial determinants of Black women's health. In a sociology of race and ethnicity paper, I examined how stress exposure and psychosocial resources like social support and religiosity contribute to Black women's mental and physical health. In another paper, I again look at this heterogeneity within Black women. So thinking about how ethnicity, nativity, and socioeconomic status also further distinguishes the mental health profiles of Black women. And though my research has led me down the path of exploring multiple substantive topics within sociology of health and illness, the theoretical traditions from which my research primarily draws are medical sociology and sociology of race and ethnicity. So today I'll discuss 2 theoretical orientations in detail as they are the most relevant for the research that I'll be presenting today. So first, I draw extensively on the stress process model developed by Lynn Perlin in the early 1980s. And the stress process model provides a useful set of explanatory mechanisms for understanding Black women's health, or I argue that that's the case. So 3 components of the model are relevant for the studies that I'm discussing today. And the first are social and economic statuses, second, stress exposure, and third, health. Social and economic statuses are status characteristics that accord differential worth to individuals and also tend to be a significant indicator of a person's self-identification. And the primary social statuses considered in a lot of sociological research is race, class, and gender. And as reflected in this modified visual model from Perlin and Bierman, social and economic statuses are very powerful in that they can influence all other elements of the model. And this is what makes the model sort of uniquely sociological. In fact, the stress process model proposes that lower social status tends to be associated with worse health outcomes and higher exposure to social stress. Next in the model is stress exposure, which refers to socio-environmental demands that tax or exceed an individual's ordinary capacity to adapt. And last in the model is health broadly defined. So though the stress process model was initially developed with psychological health in mind, it has been extended to the study of chronic conditions, self-rated health, and indicators of physiological dysregulation like allostatic load. So now I want to talk a little bit more about the stress exposures that are commonly explored in sociological research. So one of the more commonly explored stressors is this ability or inability to establish economic stability as expressed through the concept of financial strain. Karen Rook's classic work has established the dark side, if you will, of social relationships, which create relational strains with family members and significant network members. And Holmes and Rahe's social readjustment rating scale provide a foundation for a very large and growing sociological stress literature, as well as Kanner and colleagues' Daily Hassel scale. So now I want to focus on minority stress exposure, because perceived discrimination has really established an impressive literature. Williams and colleagues' major discrimination scale and ASED's everyday discrimination scale have been particularly influential. The items that comprise the major discrimination scale are listed to the right on the screen. Nevertheless, Ifetunji and Harwar have described the gendered bias in such measures, particularly major discrimination, as this scale tends to underestimate the stress exposures experienced by Black women and may better capture the discrimination Black men face in US society. Ifetunji and Harwar also argued that an intersectional perspective is essential to understand Black women's unique experiences of stress exposure. And so I'll talk second about the role of intersectionality in the work that I'm developing. So this particular framework is insightful because it places emphasis on the interlocking and mutually reinforcing relationships among multiple systems of oppression. So intersectionality attends to the unique social location of an individual at the intersection of multiple stratification systems. And in other words, one form of stratification, for example, racism, cannot be fully understood without considering how it works in tandem with other forms of stratification like sexism or classism. Black women located at the intersections of both their racialized and gendered identities were the original focus of the intersectionality framework in its first articulation by Crenshaw in her 1989 and 1991 publications. I also want to point out that intersectionality was rooted in a long tradition of Black feminist thought and scholarship that preceded the coining of the term. And health scholars are beginning to incorporate intersectionality, both theoretically and methodologically, in very interesting and exciting ways. So some examples of that include the research I have featured here, which has primarily taken a race, gender, and to some extent, race, gender, class, and age comparative approach. So these studies might be characterized by what McCall would refer to as intercategorical studies, comparing across various groups. In addition to exploring the health profiles of different race, gender, and class groups, Banks and Cohn would draw our attention to the need for intra-racial or intra-categorical research within group research to really better understand the unique determinants of health among Black women who navigate, at the very least, racialized and gendered marginalization. So with these theoretical perspectives at hand, I use them to carve out this theoretical and conceptual space for the notion of intersectional stress exposure, and specifically focusing on Black women. So this working definition of intersectional stress exposure is featured here, and it refers to those psychosocial stressors relevant to the specificities of a particular group's intersecting social identities that are rooted in a specific constellation of oppressions. And in my and my colleagues' recent Sociology Compass article, we describe how Black women in the field of psychology have recently made significant strides in operationalizing intersectional stress among Black women. So here I want to briefly discuss 4 examples. So first, the stereotypic roles for Black women scale, developed by Thomas Witherspoon and Speight, focuses on controlling images of Black women as caregivers, angry, strong, and or hypersexual. And in doing so, their work assesses the extent to which Black women feel they must conform to or defy these societal expectations. Second, Johnson and colleagues have developed the African American women's shifting scale. Similar to the notion of double consciousness articulated by Du Bois in 1903, shifting manifests as changes in appearance and speech to appear acceptable or favorable to white sensibilities. Shifting is especially salient in professional workplace settings as Black women become hyper-visible, and they're often tokens who bear this burden of representing their communities positively. And third, the gender racial microaggression scale, developed by Gioni Lewis and Neville in 2015, captured Black women's pressure to conform to Eurocentric beauty ideals, their sexual objectification, as well as their tendency to be silenced and marginalized. And last, the focus of today's talk is the Superwoman Schema scale. And I want to contextualize the Superwoman Schema by describing ongoing conversations about Black girlhood and Black womanhood that we've been privy to, or at least many of us in recent years. Affirming messages such as Black girls rock and Black girl magic have made their way into mainstream culture through social media, an annual award show, a nonprofit organization, and a book of essays declaring the sheer amazingness of being a Black woman. Moreover, these mantras of Black womanhood are rooted in a historical legacy of Black women being characterized as strong, independent, and unbreakable. Nevertheless, recently scholars and media outlets alike have pointed to the burden that such a calling, if you will, places on the proverbial shoulders of Black women. Most recently, tennis sensation Naomi Osaka and arguably the greatest gymnast of all time, Simone Biles, have rejected this notion of strong Black womanhood in exchange for protecting their mental health. These brave acts of defiance by Osaka and Biles incited a social media statement that is now gone viral, in which Black women all over the nation are declaring, quote, "Y'all not gonna stress us out," end quote. However, and this is a question I want to pose to you, what if y'all, that is society and its unrealistic expectations tethered to Black women, have already done irreparable damage? And both studies I'll present today engages this issue by centering Black women's experiences and their health. So that brings me to the first study I want to talk to you about today. So this first study specifically investigates the following research questions. So first, what is the direct association between Superwoman Schema endorsement and depressive symptoms? And I'll tell you more about the schema in the next slide. And the second question engages this issue of how do social roles potentially play a role in terms of how Superwoman Schema is endorsed, and maybe it's a moderator of this relationship between Superwoman Schema and depressive symptoms. And last, do particular social role combinations kind of relate to Superwoman Schema in these unique ways, and what kinds of implications does that have for depressive symptoms? Undergirded by Black feminist thought, Cheryl Woods-Giscombe, a psychologist and nursing scholar, described Superwoman Schema as a means for operationalizing the multi-dimensional strategies African-American women use to manage their lives in a gender and race-conscious society. The strong Black woman archetype and the Superwoman myth are rooted in the historical necessity of Black women to be resilient in the face of macro level structural barriers like enslavement, disenfranchisement, and economic marginalization. Furthermore, the portrayal of Black women as paragons of strength was in part a response to disparaging, controlling images of them as mammies, Jezebels, and sapphires. As opposed to being viewed as a dutiful servant or a sexual object or an untamed shrew, the strong Black woman trope seemingly humanized Black women by lauding their resilience, their fortitude, and their determination. And I think that's part of the reason why the schema is so highly endorsed among Black women, because it's a seemingly more positive characterization of them. The Superwoman Schema scale highlights these 5 dimensions I have listed here: expectations to exude strength, suppressing one's emotions, resistance to vulnerability, motivation to succeed despite limited resources, and assistance to others at one's own expense. An example of the items that comprise each dimension is included here in the table on the right. So a few studies conducted by Woods-Giscombe and colleagues have confirmed that endorsing Superwoman Schema is associated with elevated psychological distress among Black women. But also embedded within this framework is the idea that Black women take on multiple roles in society. And so I wanted to place the Superwoman Schema framework into conversation with research in sociology on social roles and mental health. So generally speaking, social role theory posits that social roles have a positive impact on psychological health, because participating in social roles is associated with integrative meaning and the feeling that your life has purpose. Participating in primary social roles suggests acceptance of social norms and access to social networks. Furthermore, individuals with different role configurations or combinations have distinct mental health patterns And the psychological benefits of social roles also vary by social status, including race, ethnicity, and gender. Though other social roles are critical to study, like caregiver role, grandparent, or volunteer, the primary social roles studied in the literature are those of worker, spouse, and parent. And these roles are interesting to consider for Black women, as historically, Black women have had higher rates of labor force participation compared to white and other minority women. On the other hand, Black women have had relatively lower rates of marriage and similar and sometimes higher rates of occupying the parental role. And some research suggests that social roles may be experienced in distinct ways, depending to a large degree on one's stage in the life course. In lifespan development research, the age range of 30 to 45 years has recently been identified as a critical life course period, referred to as established adulthood. Compared to the robust literature in aging and life course, as well as gerontology that centers on middle adulthood and later life, established adulthood has received relatively less empirical attention. Established adulthood, which has been colloquially referred to as the rush hour of life, is characterized by deep engagement with familial and work roles, which could potentially elicit stress for all individuals. But these role-related strains may be especially salient among individuals who also hold multiple marginalized social statuses. So examining the psychological effects of social role engagement within the context of established adulthood contributes to an emergent knowledge base on this particular life course stage, while also focusing on Black women, an understudied demographic group who likely experiences social roles differently from their more racially and gender privileged counterparts. Given that social roles are accompanied by expectations and responsibilities, it's possible that Black women who occupy a more robust set of social roles may more strongly endorse Superwoman schema ideals than their counterparts who do not occupy time-intensive primary roles, such as parent and spouse. So I hypothesize that married employed mothers will have the highest levels of Superwoman schema endorsement. In addition, the psychological effects of endorsing the Superwoman schema may differ by Black women's participation in social roles. Given the known social and economic disadvantages of single motherhood for women of any racial group, and particularly for Black women who experience some of the highest rates of single parenthood, I hypothesize that the negative psychological effects of endorsing Superwoman schema will be most intense for single parents. So to test these hypotheses, I draw data from the mechanisms underlying stress and emotions on African American women's health study. I will be referring to these data by the acronym MUSE. And the principal investigator of the MUSE data is Mehta Lewis, a clinical psychologist in epidemiology at Emory University that I've had the honor of working with over the last year and a half or so. So I want to tell you a little bit about the data. So MUSE includes a sample of a little over 400 respondents living in the Atlanta metropolitan area. And respondents represent about 200 unique census tracts in the Atlanta area. All respondents are between the ages of 30 and 46 years of age. And face-to-face interviews were conducted by Black women identified interviewers. And the interviews lasted on average about 3 hours. Data collection occurred between 2016 and 2018. And because the original intent of the study was to assess the extent to which psychosocial stressors influence cardiovascular disease risk, individuals with a history of clinical cardiovascular disease or other chronic physical diseases were not eligible for the study. However, women with diabetes and/or hypertension were eligible to participate. The dependent measure for this study is the 21-item Beck Depression Inventory, and items assess emotional states like sadness, feeling like a failure, crying, loss of interest, sleep disturbance, and fatigue. And the analysis that I will show you today uses negative binomial regression as depressive symptoms as a count measure that is over-dispersed. In terms of the independent measures, so I'll focus on the Superwoman schema, which is the 35 items that capture those 5 dimensions that I mentioned earlier. And for each of those items, there were 4 response options that range from not true for me all the way up to true for me all the time. Responses to the items were averaged so that the overall scale and the specific dimensions of Superwoman schema all have the same range of 0 to 3. And if interested, I can tell you more about those specific items in the Q&A. In terms of social roles, About 36% of the sample reported being married or living as married or cohabiting. The large majority of the sample is employed, and nearly 3/4 of the women in the sample are parents. With regards to the social role combinations, about 20% of women in the sample are employed only, which means that they were employed, but they were single and they were not parents. 41% of the respondents in the sample are single parents. 26% occupy all three social roles, so employed, married with children. And then there was this other residual kind of miscellaneous category of 51 respondents who had some other role combination. So we decided we didn't want to eliminate them. We placed them in a separate category. And then all the models that I'll show you today adjust for household income, educational attainment, as well as age. All right, moving to the results. So in this table, I provide the means and standard deviations in brackets for the key study measures. The first column includes the listing of the measures and their ranges. And subsequent columns include means and standard deviations for the full sample, and then for each set of role combinations. Orange colored cells indicate that that particular group is significantly different from the group with bolded text. So in terms of depressive symptoms, we see that single parents and those with other role combinations have significantly higher depressive symptoms compared to employed married parents. In terms of the Superwoman scale overall, single parents more highly endorse the Superwoman schema than those who are employed only. And then I want to draw your attention to those particular dimensions or subscales of Superwoman schema. So we first observed for obligation to show strength, single mothers more strongly endorse this dimension than those who are employed only. We also observed that in terms of resistance to vulnerability, it's highest among single parents who significantly differ from employed married parents. And last, obligation to help others is significantly higher for employed married parents as well as single parents compared to employed only women. So all in all, we observed moderate to high levels of endorsement of Superwoman schema, but with some variation by social role configurations. Specifically, single parents are more highly endorsing certain elements of Superwoman schema and are more highly endorsing Superwoman schema overall. So now in terms of the first research question, results from the negative binomial regression analysis demonstrates a positive association between Superwoman schema and depressive symptoms. The incidence rate ratio is reported here. More specifically, each unit increase in Superwoman schema is associated with higher depressive symptoms by a factor of 2.58. And this is graphed to the right, showing depressive symptoms predicted values for mean Superwoman schema endorsement, as well as one standard deviation below and above the mean. So this confirms past research. However, what remains unclear is whether all dimensions of Superwoman schema are associated with heightened risk for depressive symptoms. So when examining each specific dimension of Superwoman schema, suppressing emotions and the obligation to help others are associated with higher depressive symptoms, but there is no association between the other three dimensions of mental health. So I believe this to be encouraging news, at least for Black women, because it appears that not all dimensions of Superwoman schema endorsement are detrimental to mental health, and this is an important caveat. It is compelling that the dimension of the greatest magnitude is the obligation to help others. To give you a sense of this component of the scale, items include statements such as, I take on roles and responsibilities when I'm already overwhelmed. There's no time for me because I'm always taking care of others and I feel obligated to take care of others. So it's this particular dimension or element of providing support to everyone while simultaneously neglecting self-care that seems to be the most significant threat, if you will, to Black women's psychological health. So in terms of the second and third research questions, I found no evidence of social roles or combinations moderating the linkage between Superwoman schema and depressive symptoms. The graph on the left reports the predicted values of depressive symptoms by Superwoman schema endorsement for each social role combination, and including the confidence intervals as well. So as you can observe, the Superwoman schema depressive symptoms association seems to operate similarly across role configurations. So just to summarize the findings from this first study, single parents more strongly endorse Superwoman schema compared to women with all other role configurations. So this did not provide support for my first hypothesis that employed married mothers would most strongly endorse Superwoman schema. The second set of findings show that Superwoman schema endorsement is associated with higher depressive symptoms, but when we look at the more nuanced subscales or elements of Superwoman schema, it's emotion suppression and this obligation to help others that is particularly harmful for mental health. And last, social roles did not moderate the association between Superwoman schema and mental health. So I didn't find support for the hypothesis that single parents, there would be that strongest linkage between Superwoman schema and mental health for them. So as we were wrapping up this study, we started to think about, well, if Superwoman schema is related in this way to depressive symptoms, then perhaps Superwoman schema also influences physical health. And if so, Superwoman schema may contribute to Black women's disproportionate risk for poor health vis-a-vis other groups. So this really led us to our second study that I'm going to discuss today, which is anchored by 3 research questions. So first, we're just interested in that direct association between Superwoman schema, endorsement, and self-rated health. And then we're interested in whether or not there are specific dimensions of Superwoman schema that are especially problematic for health. And last, we're interested in the extent to which socioeconomic status, as indicated by annual household income and educational attainment, moderate or condition the association between Superwoman schema and self-rated health. So at this point, I've talked quite a bit about Superwoman schema, but I want to talk about how socioeconomic status also enters into this discussion. And I'm sure all of us in this virtual space are convinced that socioeconomic position is a critical form of stratification that has implications for a variety of outcomes, including health. So in the medical sociological literature, socioeconomic status has been described as this fundamental cause of health and differences therein. Nevertheless, evidence of the typical SES health gradient among Black Americans is actually quite mixed. So Black middle-class members do not necessarily enjoy the same benefits, including income, wealth accumulation, and health when compared to their white middle-class peers. And this notion of differential benefits, according to middle-class status, is consistent with the diminishing returns hypothesis, which posits that Blacks do not accrue the same health benefits of gaining higher socioeconomic status as their white peers. And evidence of this has been identified in terms of health outcomes like allostatic load, chronic conditions, and depressive symptoms. So these findings could perhaps be clarified by examining how socioeconomic status operates in tandem with psychosocial factors, here is Superwoman schema, to influence Black women's health outcomes. So because the Superwoman schema construct has been recently developed, there's limited evidence regarding whether Superwoman schema differs for Black women across the socioeconomic spectrum. However, based on Woods-Gascombe's qualitative focus group research, one dimension of Superwoman schema resonated strongly with Black women who had higher educational attainment. So she specifically found that among focus group participants of women with some college education, they described this strong and deep desire to provide financially for their families despite not having enough for themselves. And she also found that college-educated women were the most likely to feel an obligation to help family members financially. Last, in a recent study by Allen and colleagues, they note that lower educational attainment was correlated with higher levels of emotion suppression endorsement. So this suggests that certain elements of Superwoman schema may actually be higher among women who are lower socioeconomic status. So this provides some preliminary evidence that SES might differentiate endorsement of SWS, as well as moderate the relationship between Superwoman schema and health. So for the second study, I use the same data source, the Muse, but I do want to note that the sample was obtained with the express intention of acquiring a socioeconomically diverse sample of Black women in Atlanta. So 50% of the sample is by design college educated, and this really makes the data ideal for an investigation of socioeconomic distinctions in stress exposure and health. The dependent measure for the study is self-rated health, which is a subjective health measure commonly used in medical sociology and health services research. Though subjective in nature and not without serious limitations, it has been shown to be a predictor of morbidity and mortality. There were very few respondents who rated their health as poor, so fair and poor were merged together into a single category. So poor and fair is indicated by 1 all the way up to excellent at 4. And I use ordered logistic regression for the analysis that I'll show you today. So I use the same Superwoman Schema scale as the first study. And just to focus a little bit on the socioeconomic distribution of the sample, again, as I stated earlier, about half of the sample is college educated, 21% have some college or occupational training, and 30% have a high school diploma or less. In terms of annual household income, there's also a really kind of nice distribution, if you will, in terms of these 4 categories of ranges of income. So about 1/4 of the respondents in the sample have an annual household income of $35,000 or less. And on the opposite end of the distribution, we see that about 30% of women in the sample have an annual household income of $75,000 or more. All the analysis that I'll show you today control for age, depressive symptoms, as well as parental, marital, and employment status. So moving to the descriptive statistics, in this table, I provide the means and standard deviations in brackets for the key study measures. In the far right column, I also make note of significant differences across socioeconomic status. So I want to point out that the measure of self-rated health suggests good to very good health in this sample of early midlife women. So that mean 2.41 is between that good and very good category. There's also evidence of a socioeconomic status gradient in that higher educational attainment and income were associated with better self-rated health. And in terms of Superwoman Schema, endorsement levels are quite high at 1.92, approaching that true for me sometimes category. And when we look at specific components of Superwoman Schema, some are more highly endorsed than others. Specifically, I have bolded obligation to present strength and motivation to succeed because they are the most highly endorsed. Surprisingly, there were few educational or income differences in Superwoman Schema endorsement, which suggests that this schema is actually highly endorsed among most, if not all, Black women, regardless of their socioeconomic position. Only one difference emerged where resistance to vulnerability was more highly endorsed among women with some college experience. So now moving to the first research questions. Results from the ordered logistic regression model in which odds ratios are reported, we actually found that there was a null association between Superwoman Schema and self-rated health. However, we also decided to explore again whether or not there are specific dimensions of Superwoman Schema that might be associated with self-rated health. And when examining each dimension of Superwoman Schema, this is when the significant results emerged. Odds ratios reported in Model 2 show that 2 dimensions of Superwoman Schema are indeed associated with self-rated health. Specifically, obligation to present an image of strength is associated with better self-rated health, while obligation to help others was associated with worse self-rated health. It's compelling that the obligation to help others is the only dimension associated with worse self-rated health. Yet again, as we observe for depressive symptoms, it is this element of providing support or feeling this obligation to help others while simultaneously neglecting self-care that is most threatening to Black women's perceptions of their health. On the other hand, and interestingly, presenting an image of strength may offer a sense of affirmation for Black women that can actually be health protective, because we see that an obligation to present an image of strength is associated with better self-rated health. In assessing whether socioeconomic status moderated the association between SWS and self-rated health, I begin with the household income results. What I'm referring to here is research question 3A. After running statistical interactions between Superwoman Schema, its subcomponents, and household income, 4 interactions emerged as significant. Superwoman Schema overall, as well as the dimensions of resistance to vulnerability, motivation to succeed, and obligation to help others. Interestingly, Superwoman Schema endorsement was most detrimental to self-rated health for Black women with the highest income levels, so those with a household income of $75,000 or more. In the next slide, I'm going to show you a visual depiction of this interaction for Superwoman Schema overall in self-rated health. However, the trend is nearly identical for the Superwoman Schema subcomponents. So figure 1 includes predicted probabilities of self-rated health categories by income, as well as Superwoman Schema endorsement. Of note is the yellow line that represents the highest income earners. For poor, fair, and good self-rated health, which are those two figures at the top, as SWS increases, so does the predicted probability of poor, fair, or good health. On the other hand, if you look at the yellow line in the bottom two graphs, the predicted probability of very good and excellent health actually declines as Superwoman Schema endorsement increases. The other income groups do not significantly differ from one another. Now moving to part B of this third research question, is education also a moderator? And the answer is yes. And education was a moderator for Superwoman Schema overall, as well as obligation to present strength and to help others. Here, however, Superwoman Schema endorsement was most detrimental to self-rated health for Black women with some college experience. So the visual depiction of the interaction between Superwoman Schema overall and educational attainment is shown here for each self-rated health category. And of particular interest here is the red line, which indicates Black women with some college education. As SWS increases, so does the predicted probability of reporting fair, poor, or good health. On the other hand, if you look at those bottom two graphs, as SWS increases, the predicted probability of reporting very good or excellent health actually decreases, but only for women with some college experience. So now to summarize those findings from this second study, obligation to present strength was actually associated with better self-rated health. On the other hand, obligation to help others was inversely associated with self-rated health. So higher endorsement of obligation to help others was associated with relatively poor self-rated health. In addition, the findings for socioeconomic status moderation, I think, were really interesting and fascinating. So Superwoman Schema had the strongest negative influence on self-rated health among those with the highest income, which is consistent with the diminishing returns hypothesis. The Superwoman Schema, however, had the strongest negative influence in terms of educational attainment on those with some college. And I think the results of the some college educated Black women are similar to findings presented in Anna Zajakova's work, in which individuals with some college experience gains in earnings, but little health returns to having some college education. And I think the some college women in this sample may face unique disadvantages. For example, unrealized educational goals. Perhaps they have educational debt that is inconsistent with their ability to pay off that debt since they were unable to complete a bachelor's degree. So I do think that analytically, Black women with some college experience will be interesting to further study and investigate in the context of Superwoman Schema. So now I want to talk about sort of the theoretical and the research implications of both studies together. So in terms of intersectionality, the Superwoman Schema measure is quite innovative in the sense that it's one of the first kind of constructs to attempt to quantitatively operationalize this notion of the strong Black woman with the purpose of examining its psychological and physical health effects. And in this way of being, this sort of cognitive schema about Black womanhood provides an intracategorical or within group measure of stress and coping, which could potentially be a linchpin mechanism for explaining middle-class Black women's relatively poor physical health compared to other race gender groups. And so I'm really thankful for the work that Woods Gascombe has done in terms of really carefully crafting and putting together this construct. So with regards to the stress process, these results also, I think they really challenge sociological stress researchers to think about how stress and coping measures should be, and maybe they aren't currently, really attuned to the unique experiences of individuals at the intersecting and multiple social identities that they possess, Even beyond thinking about Black women, other multiply marginalized groups may face unique challenges not captured by prototypical stress measures. And others have argued this about other populations. So for example, Elon Meyer's work on minority stress among sexual minorities. I think sociological stress research has to move forward in terms of thinking about these unique stressors that may be specific to individuals who hold a particular constellation of disadvantaged social identities. So in terms of life course and aging, while midlife and late life tend to be the focus of life course and aging research, established adulthood, I'm convinced, is a critical period in the life course. And this stage is particularly relevant for Black women who experience relatively poor physical health vis-a-vis virtually all other race gender groups once they reach midlife and later. So this study really kind of haunts me a bit, but I want to share it with you because I think it speaks to why established adulthood is so important to study. So Geronimus and colleagues' work on biological weathering showed that at ages 49 to 55 years of age, Black women were already biologically 7.5 years older than white women. I think it's really essential for us to figure out what's happening to Black women prior to reaching midlife. And so thinking about established adulthood as this critical period can really perhaps help us better uncover how the health of Black women begins to deteriorate before they reach midlife. So we really need longitudinal kinds of studies that really begin to capture this critical life course stage. With regards to fundamental cause theory, different measures of socioeconomic status are related to health in these nuanced ways that I don't think we've fully begun to tease apart. So findings from the second study I presented provides this additional evidence of a non-equivalence of socioeconomic status indicators, since the results for educational attainment and household income were quite distinct from one another, with the highest income earning women having the sort of the worst effects of Superwoman schema, but then some college women having those elevated risks as they more highly endorse Superwoman schema. So last, with regards to role theory, and this is sort of like harkening back to study number one, the finding that social roles did not moderate the association between Superwoman schema and depressive symptoms was unexpected. However, this finding reflects the reality that occupying societally valued roles may yield limited health benefits for Black women. And though I didn't show the full models, there was also no direct association between social roles and mental health in this sample of early midlife Black women. Thus, the universality of roles as being salubrious is really challenged by the findings from that first study. In terms of the research implications, overall, the study results reveal greater complexity in our understanding of how Superwoman schema contributes to health by focusing on a broad measure of physical well-being, that is self-rated health, and a commonly used measure of mental health, depressive symptoms. Also, the health consequences of Superwoman schema are nuanced by the specific dimension under investigation. On one hand, feeling an obligation to help others at one's own expense was universally associated with poor physical and mental health. On the other hand, showing strength was actually associated with better self-rated health. So these results reveal that really more research is necessary to understand how this particular construct may be related to a variety of health outcomes. And I think in terms of physical health, self-rated health is but a start, but definitely not a finishing point in terms of thinking about the ways in which Superwoman schema might affect other health outcomes. And this is related to my second point. Superwoman schema may contribute to middle-class Black women's disproportionate risk for poor health, especially given that the highest income respondents in the sample were the most negatively influenced by endorsing Superwoman schema. Prior research reveals that college-educated Black women have unexpectedly higher rates of cardiovascular disease and maternal mortality given their socioeconomic status. Perhaps Superwoman schema contributes to such outcomes, but this awaits future study. And speaking of future research, I do want to share just a few future research directions that I've been considering over the past few months. How am I doing on time? Do I have a few more minutes?
You're good on time.
Okay, great. So with pilot grant funding, my next steps are to embark on studying how intersectional stress exposure influences sleep health, and expanding to other types of intersectional stressors. So for instance, I discussed briefly before Lewis and Neville's gendered racial microaggression scale. And so that's another intersectional stressor that's available in this amazing data that Tanae Lewis has on this cohort of Black women in Atlanta. So I'm interested in exploring how gendered racial microaggressions might affect Black women's sleep health as well as Superwoman Schema. I also am currently working on studies focused on Black women in mid to late life using the health and retirement study data. And I'm especially interested in cumulative stress exposure across the life course. So my ultimate aspiration is to really sort of acquire grant funding that would allow me to examine psychosocial stress and health across Black women's life course from early adulthood through late life. And I know that we don't always have the data, the cradle to the grave data, if you will, but sort of trying to find interesting ways to cobble together different data sources so that we can have a more robust understanding of both stress exposure and their effects on health among Black women from early all the way to late life. And last, I want to just acknowledge Tanae Lewis, who allowed me to graciously work with her research team amidst a global pandemic. I was really grateful for the opportunity to meet with her highly interdisciplinary team and learn so much from them. I'm grateful for the funding that enabled the data collection process for this particular cohort. And I also am really thankful for the Vanderbilt Community Lab for the intersectional study of Black women and girls in society, which has really helped to hone sort of my thinking around Black women's intersectional experiences and what types of implications that has for their life outcomes. And I just want to show you a brief picture of our lab at Vanderbilt. So these women, myself included, we've been working together over the past 3 years to really develop a research hub around Black women and their experiences at Vanderbilt and beyond. So thank you so much. And I'm really excited to engage further with the audience, and I'm looking forward to your feedback. Thanks.
Thank you, Christy. Courtney Thomas Tobin unfortunately had to leave for another obligation. So let me, the first to say thank you so much for this really interesting talk that has already raised a lot of questions in the chat and stimulated a lot of people thinking. So why don't I just read out the first question from the chat. We might as well start here. Patrick Waveline had, I'll make sure I get to the top. There are so many. Okay, so Patrick had the same question I did actually. Patrick wanted you to elaborate on the diminishing returns to high SES. We understand that you found empirical support for this assumption that there were diminishing returns, but Patrick's not familiar with the assumption in the context of mental health and doesn't know why one would assume smaller returns to high SES minority status in the first place. So I'll throw it out.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that question, Patrick. So there's a body of research that really focuses on the stress of higher status, particularly among Black Americans in the context of the stressors and strains that they have to navigate, especially in the workplace, right? So while they may have, to some extent, access to economic resources by way of having a salary related to their professional, life that they've developed for themselves, they also feel a high sense of hyper visibility in the workplace that could be stressful. Also, if they are first generation, which many Black Americans are, first generation middle class, there's also the strains and stress associated with financial obligations to family members in the context of their personal lives. And so there's been a lot of hypothesizing around why we see these diminishing returns. But if we compare the health profiles of similarly economically positioned Black and white Americans, Black Americans tend to be still so like leaps and bounds below their white counterparts who share the same economic status as them, but because of these racialized stressors and economic disadvantages inherent with just being Black in America, they don't always benefit to the same degree as higher SES and professional white respondents. So that's what I meant by the diminishing returns hypothesis. I also saw another private message question. Can I address that one really quickly, Maggie?
Yes, of course.
So I think this was from from Anne. She asked, are the role configuration categories mutually exclusive? They look like they may be overlapping. So they actually are mutually exclusive. And unfortunately, because of small sample size and cell size issues, we weren't able to look at all of those role configurations. But I just want to show you what the layout looks like, if I may. I have like a slide where I can show you this. Let's see. So where are we? We had originally wanted to look at all the social role combinations that are represented here. But as you can see, among single parents, there were so few who were parent only that we had to put parent only and employed parents together in our analysis. And then we compared employed only, employed married parents, and then those other role combinations, these were the ones that had really tiny cell sizes. So these are the other role combinations that we were interested in, but because of small cell sizes, we ended up putting this group kind of together. But I know, like, conceptually, theoretically, like they're just sort of a miscellaneous group. But we did still find those interesting findings in terms of comparing employed only single parent and employed married parents. But I just kind of wanted to show you that because I did have to go through that part kind of quickly.
Thank you. Rather than have me read out people's questions, for folks who are still here, why don't I just call on people and let them express their own questions. So Shiva Ruhani, I believe you're next.
Thanks, Megan. And thank you, Dr. Erving, for the presentation. It was super, super interesting. So I guess this is the first time I'm hearing about this schema, I think, like many of us. And I think partially because I don't know how it was asked. Is this something that's more to do about asking Black women about the role of Black women in case it might be an opinion that's stable, or is it about their idea of themselves? And in which case, there are some things, I guess I was wondering if there are some items that might be so maybe endogenous to being a parent, like I feel obliged to help others all the time. It's because you have kids and you're a single parent, and that might also affect the mental health strain. Did you think to tease these things out, or is this more just a beginning exploratory analysis to see how these things are related?
Yeah, that's a really excellent question. So I have to give a lot of credit to Cheryl Woods-Giscombe, who developed this original scale. So the way in which she developed the scale, she began with focus groups, sort of a focus group methodology, where she asked a series of questions to a sample of economically diverse Black women about what does it mean to be a Black woman. So then she analyzed those data and came up with this concept of Superwoman Schema, but then she wanted to take it further and conducted survey research, where she then asked a series of questions that emerged from the focus group studies. And then from there, she was able to look at multiple samples of Black women to then test the psychometric properties of the scale and validate it for Black women. However, what you said is really interesting is that we do know that some dimensions of this scale may also be relevant to women of other ethnic backgrounds. It could even be relevant for men. So I do think that it would be really exciting in my mind to assess kind of whether or not these dimensions of Superwoman Schema are prevalent or salient in other additional groups beyond just Black women. But she originally validated the scale focusing on Black women because she was really interested in trying to understand the ways in which Black women navigate a race and gender conscious society and some of the unique strains that they experienced that were tied to Black womanhood. So I do think it would be exciting for this to be tested and used among other groups, but she originally sort of built it specifically for Black women.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
So next on my list, I have Shanae Rhodes.
Hi, good afternoon, Dr. Erving.
Good afternoon.
I was so excited. I asked my professor if I could skip a little bit of class to attend your presentation.
Thank you.
They allowed me to. I'm super excited because the Superwoman Schema is a tool that I'm using in my study.
Oh, that's great.
Yes, ma'am. So your presentation was very enlightening, and I hope to be able to cite your work when I get to the point of publication. But my question is, I'm a PhD student, by the way, so I'm learning a lot. I'm noticing as I did my literature review that a lot of the literature looking at stress in African American women tend to use the CESD to examine depressive symptoms. But I also noticed that in some of the more recent literature that's focused on African Americans specifically, they state that more culturally focused measures are needed to actually address depression. So I just wanted to know, what were some of your reasons for selecting the Beck Depression Inventory? Thank you.
Yes, Sinead, thank you so much for those questions. And I think it's really exciting that there are different scholars across a variety of fields who are recognizing the utility of this construct, because Cheryl Woods-Gascombe has just done such extensive work over like a decade to get this scale constructed and validated. So I think your point about the CESD versus the Beck Depression Inventory or any other scale, first, the reason why I selected it is because that's the only depressive symptoms measure that was asked in this cohort or sample of Black women. So I was limited by what was available to me. But I do think your point about more culturally focused measures of mental health is really important, because there's a scholar in sociology, Tamara Babouf-LaFontant, who argues that the way in which depression may manifest for Black women may be more like somatization or sort of bodily complaints or pain. And so I do think that if we want to think about mental health in a culturally informed way, we do have to incorporate perhaps elements of like somatization into how we think about mental illness as well. So I do think the CESD and the BDI are limited in that regard. They include some aspects of like physiological responses like fatigue, for example, or maybe sleep disturbance, but they may not fully capture all of these sort of culturally embedded ways of expressing mental illness. So I agree with you that we do need more nuanced and culturally informed measures of mental health. But yeah, I was just sort of bound by what was available in the data.
Thank you, Dr. Erving. And what was Tamara, what was her name, Dr.?
Tamara Babouf-LaFontant. I'm gonna put the link to her work in the chat once I pull it up.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Next on my list, I have Joni Brown.
Hi, Dr. Erving. Thank you for your talk. I'm very interested in intersectional stressors related to Black women, because I also study Black women, but I look at gendered racial socialization, some messages from my child and how those affects like later health in Black women. So I had a couple of questions throughout your talk because it's so exciting. So the first that I wanted to ask you about was related to the first study, and that was about the race of the spouses. I probably guess that the sample was probably small and it wouldn't be, too worthwhile to look at it in that sample of women. But I just thought about the race of the spouse, because I've read before that Black women who marry Black men, sometimes like their socioeconomic status drops whenever that happens. And so I was wondering if like the dimension regarding like sense of the dimensions regarding like sense of obligations may be different between women who have different spouses of different races. So I don't know if you want me to like go off on all the questions and then have you answer them, or we could do it one by one.
I'm okay with like a second question, then I'll try to answer both. Yeah. Okay.
So, and then the second question was about your finding regarding the obligation to present an image of strength. I know you said that you like looking at objective measures is also important, but I couldn't help but think that if these women, think that or endorse the fact that they have to present themselves as being, strong, I could also see, like, it makes sense why they would also rate their health better than, and so I feel like, what if it's the opposite? What if they aren't actually as healthy as they try to, or that they actually believe they are? And then the last question was about indirect effect of Black women's Superwoman schema. So I've already been interested in this, the work regarding Superwoman schema, and I know that it predicts higher allostatic load in Black women, but I was interested in indirect effects in terms of close familial members. So example, I'm a Black woman and I endorse a strong obligation to my family members and so on. I want the best for them. Could that result in better, health or physical or mental health outcomes for my family members? Or could my high endorsement of these dimensions also negatively affect my family member because I'm, maybe there's some other things going on. But those are just the questions that I had.
Yes, it sounds like we need to have a whole meeting because I have so many notes written down. So I'm going to try to briefly answer the questions, but I'm always available via email if you want to follow up on any of these because they're all three really good questions. So the first question about the race of the spouse. Honestly, I had not thought of that because Black women have such high rates of marrying Black men, marrying within their racial group. But that might be sort of interesting to think about. So I know that in this cohort of Black women, the race of the spouse was not collected, but interestingly, the race of close social network members, like friends, is a part of the data, and also the racial composition of the neighborhood where you grew up and the neighborhood where you live now and your workplace. So I do think those factors might matter in interesting ways with Superwoman schema endorsement, but unfortunately I can't get at race of the spouse. But I would also venture to say having a spouse that is not Black presents its own different type of racializing stress exposure. So I don't know if one is better than the other. It's you're going to have race-related stress exposure regardless, right? Yeah. So I don't know if one is better or worse, but they could be qualitatively different, right? Yeah. The second point about obligations present strength. Yeah. So if women are presenting an image of strength, then they may be more likely to say that their health is good when they might be dying on the inside. So I think that's why we really need sort of biomarkers or other measures of health. So that's why I said the self-rated health piece is a starting point, but I think you're right, because they're both subjective measures, the subjectivity can make it difficult to tease apart the direction of the effect, which is why I think we need something like allostatic load or other types of physiological dysregulation kinds of measures. And then the last question, as you were talking about potential indirect effects of Superwoman schema endorsement, I thought about this emerging literature on vicarious stress exposure. So one of the doc students in the research group that I'm a part of with Tanae Lewis is looking at stress that has been experienced by you directly and stress that has been experienced by someone in your social network, like a family member or a friend. So I do think that it wouldn't be too far-fetched to venture to say that you endorsing these elements of Superwoman schema could have indirect effects on people around you. Or even if we think about, you were talking about racial gender socialization. If we think about intergenerationally, how the Superwoman schema is so powerful, because I saw my mom do it and I saw my grandmother do it. They are real life superwomen in my life. And so of course I'm gonna take that on because that's been a part of my racial and gender socialization. So I think that could be interesting, thinking about indirect or vicarious experiences of Superwoman schema and how that has implications for health. I think you just came up with a whole program of research there. Really interesting questions though, and I'd love to continue the conversation.
Yes, definitely. Thank you.
That's great. So before I move on, I just want to say at this point, if you want to just add your name to the chat and say, I have a question, that's fine. Don't feel like you need to type out your whole question in order to be called on. Next on my list, I have Adriana.
Hi, I think you already answered my question, but basically as I was listening to the questions that make up the components of the schema, I was thinking, well, I think that, maybe other women, maybe Catholic people like myself might be answering this question and obligation to help others, for instance, in similar ways. So I was wondering, do we know anything about how other groups would answer these questions? And and or whether the associations would be the same. And here I was thinking that it'd be very interesting to have some kind of decomposition and thinking about, are there some of the racial gaps in health explained either by the incidence of these different perceptions or by how these perceptions translate into health, in some kind of decomposition kind of way. But I think you already stated that this hasn't been done for other groups, and so we actually don't know what that is. Is that right?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. But if you can aid me in the process of getting these types of scales on nationally representative data, that would be fantastic, because I am intrigued by this notion of whether or not this is something that is uniquely endorsed by Black women, or do other women of other ethnic groups also endorse it, and maybe to varying degrees, right? I think that is a very interesting question that remains to be fully examined. But I do think, it could be something like, so there are these measures of stress that were developed for particular groups, like Henryism, like high active coping, was developed in the context of rural, Southern, low-income Black men. But now there's this really robust literature about Henryism and high active coping being bad for lots of people's health. Right. And so my hope is that we'll have a similar kind of spread where, even though these measures and constructs have been developed to focus specifically on a unique experience, there could be other groups to varying degrees who experience and endorse this schema. And so I do think it would be interesting if we can get these types of items on national surveys to look at and compare and do that decomposition analysis, because I do think that's an interesting area of future research.
Okay, yeah, I have a thought maybe about how that might be able to do that.
Okay.
So maybe we'll be in touch. I think it'd be very interesting to see how this pans out in other groups. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Next on my list, Andrew Hess.
Hi, can everyone hear me? Okay,
Yep.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Erving, for the talk today. It was really interesting. I think my question might have been partially answered in Joni's line of questioning about the expectations in your social group or your social network. But what I was thinking about was how the expectations placed on Black women to embrace this Superwoman Schema endorsement type of idea, how that might come into play based on whether you live in a particularly segregated area or an area with higher crime, and you feel like you have to protect your loved ones, your family and whatnot, or also a more segregated workplace. And that could be segregated one way or the other, whether it's 85+% Black or 85+% white. Does that sort of data exist? And if it did, do you think that could lead to another potential source of variation to explore?
Yeah, Andrew, thank you so much for that question. So again, this research group at Emory is just on fire with all kinds of research. So one of the scholars in the group is currently geocoding the data on the Black women in Atlanta metropolitan area so that she can look at indexes of dissimilarity and other indicators of segregation, because she's interested in how that affects cardiovascular disease risk. But I do agree with you that the racial composition of the workplace and the neighborhood context could have implications for the level of endorsement of Superwoman Schema, because as you were stating, I would imagine in more sort of disadvantaged neighborhoods, neighborhoods with higher levels of crime, you may be more likely to endorse, feeling like you have to protect and help others, especially if you're a mother, for example, who has young children. So I would venture to say that it matters, and maybe that could be another, research endeavor down the road, because I think those spatial components and the racial composition of those spatial areas matter in unique ways for health, and I imagine they would matter for Superwoman Schema endorsement as well.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, next on my list, I have Jasmine Hill.
Hi, thank you so much for this work. I had a question that appreciate the offer to just say I have a question, because I'm working it out in my head.
Yeah, sure.
But this work is so important, and there's a part of it that as a Black woman, it's well, dang, it's stressed, gonna be stressed. So I've been thinking a lot about the question of which of these conditions within the SWS are malleable or changeable. Like it seems like some things are about racial identification, like or the identity of being a Black woman, the obligation to be strong, like strikes me as one that's difficult to change unless there's some kind of intergroup transformation of how we define the category of like what a Black woman is. But I write about, I really was struck by the obligation to help others. I write about kin support. And so that's the one that I'm thinking like, that's the one that feels malleable. If there was could we imagine, and I'm trying to think of what the measure would be, but could we imagine if there was some transformation in the social safety net, for example, like is like that's the linked fate measure to me. And it's like, it seems that if there was some transformation in the condition of low-income family members, for example, perhaps that wouldn't be felt so severely. Like, is that one really about race, or is that one about kind of the socioeconomic position that Black women uniquely are put in? But just kind of think through like which of these are movable overall. That's the one that jumped out to me. I'm wondering if there's anything that jumps out at you.
Yeah, I think that's a really astute observation. So the obligation to help others being rooted in these structural disadvantages that Black women and their families face is spot on, right? Like, I think that's completely spot on. In addition to thinking about, structural things like mass incarceration of Black men, like that's a structural thing too, right? That's rooted in like racism. But yeah, I think a lot of this is structurally imposed, and Black women are responding to these conditions. But in terms of ones that are malleable, I actually was thinking about this notion of suppressing emotions and resisting vulnerability. I think as our culture is shifting with the development of things like therapy for Black girls and reducing the stigma associated with seeking, mental health care, I think some of that could slowly start to be dismantled. So for instance, I have a therapist and I go to therapy. My mom and my grandmother, they would have never gone to therapy because they think that's for people who are crazy, right? So I think generationally speaking, I think the emotion suppression and resisting vulnerability piece, and what, Naomi Osaka and Simone Biles are doing in terms of thinking about, self-care over performance, I think those are some things that can slowly start to shift. But I still think Black women gonna take a lot of pride in feeling like they're strong, So, and maybe strength has to be redefined and reconceptualized too, right? But those are some of the ones that I was thinking about that may be malleable because of the changes and shifts we're seeing culturally in terms of responding to mental illness. But that the obligation to help others one, I think you're right. It's rooted in structure and structural problems.
Thank you.
Okay, so I've come to the ends of the questions that were in the chat. Would anyone else, we do have a few minutes left if anyone else has a question. Adriana, is that a hand?
Yeah, well, I was going to follow up on that and ask about kind of, because you're talking about like obligation to help others, and that might be more important in certain socioeconomic strata. But I was thinking about other things like the role of religion, for instance, in creating those obligations. Sorry, I speak here as like a Catholic raised person. And what I sometimes think about is whether these serves another purpose, like we pay for it with our health, but it serves other purposes in our lives as well. And so there might be, we might be thinking about this and saying like, okay, how can we lower these, these responses in these categories because they're bad for health, but maybe they're good in other dimensions, for how we think about ourselves or how we help our community. And sometimes we do things that are bad for our health because they're good for other things. I don't know. Anyway, just the thought.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting point, that there may be these spiritual obligations or commitments that could also be playing a role. And the other thing I was thinking about as you were talking, Adriana and Jasmine, is that yes, an obligation to help others can be bad for health, but the other side of the coin is that hopefully social network members, family, friends, loved ones, church members are also providing you with some kind of social support. So I hope that, like, you know, it's not being unreciprocated. In some cases it's not, right? You're giving more than you receive, but I would like to think that in some situations it is reciprocal, right? Like you are maintaining or gaining or acquiring benefits psychologically and physically from receiving social support as opposed to just giving and giving and giving.
Yeah, and you know, the other piece there, for instance, about like appearing strong, you know, something that I think about is, you know, maybe people perceive that there's a benefit to their children or to other people from behaving this way. And so, I mean, yes, you are maybe suffering as a result and your health suffers, but maybe you like do it for your children or something. I don't know.
Yeah, another great point, right? Yeah, maybe that's a part of parental, like, racial socialization, right? Like Black mothers want to be strong for their children because they know their children are going to face a difficult world in which they have to be strong because of racism and sexism and all the other isms.
Great, thank you. Are there any other questions?
I've been trying to follow in the chat, but I think you said all of those were answered, right?
I think I did.
Okay.
Please speak up if I did miss your question in the chat. I was trying to keep up with it. So any other questions from the chat or from the virtual room? Okay, well, if not, let's give a big hand to Christy for a wonderful and obviously very stimulating talk.
Thank you so much.
I want to remind the students in the room that you are all welcome to stay on with Christy. We have a pro seminar immediately following this. You may use this link and continue the conversation with Christy. So thank you so much for coming. This was wonderful. Gave us all so much to think about. So
thank you so much, Megan. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Oh, that's right. I'm staying on this link. Sorry. I forgot that quickly. So for everyone who's staying, do you mind if I take like just a quick bio break? I'm just going to run to the bathroom and I'll be back in like 2 minutes. Is that okay?
That's great. Absolutely.
Okay. Thanks, Esmeralda.
And Shanae, I see your question in the chat. I'll go ahead and send you the email.